Hello, how are you? It's nice to see you all. Wow, crowded space. Welcome to the Super Spreader event. So I know that today's talk is nominally about dying tech platforms, but before I talk about enshittification, I want to talk a little about nurses. So there was a January 2025 report from the Roosevelt Institute that documented how increasingly nurses in America who work as contract nurses are no longer employed by regional staffing agencies, and instead these days they're primarily employed by one of three apps that present themselves as Uber for nurses. And these apps don't tell a nurse from day to day how much they're going to get paid. That's determined when they book a shift. And there is something very high-tech going on with the way these nurses' wages are being set. The nursing apps, this cartel of three companies, ShiftKey, ShiftMed, and CareRev, play all kinds of games with labor pricing in the moment as the nurse's labor is being paid for. So before ShiftKey offers a nurse a shift, it can purchase her or his history from a credit bureau and determine whether or not the nurse is carrying a high degree of credit card debt, especially delinquent debt. And nurses that are more indebted get offered a lower wage on the grounds that people who are indebted will work for less money because they're more desperate. So if you want to find people who will come and do the grunt work of caring for the sick, the dying, and the elderly, you can preferentially seek out people who are also in a lot of credit card debt. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things going on here, and obviously every single one of them is terrible beyond belief. But the reason I bring it up is because it is emblematic of enshittification, this term I coined to describe technical platform decay. When I first started talking about enshittification, I was focused on the external symptomology of enshittification, that three-stage process that starts with a platform being good to its end users and finding a way to lock them in. So Google, you recall, originally minimized the amount of ads and maximized the amount of spending that they put into engineering high-quality search results. But as they were doing this, they were also buying their way to dominance. They were bribing every service with a search box to make that a Google search box that was wired into Google's servers. So no matter which browser you were using, no matter what mobile operating system you used, no matter which carrier you had, every search box you typed into fed a query to Google and not to a rival. This got so batshit that by the early 2020s, they were spending $20 to $25 billion a year to make sure that no one ever used a search engine that wasn't Google. So that is stage one. Be good to the end users, but find a way to lock the end users in. Stage two exploits that lock-in by making things worse for those end users, but not out of mere sadism, although arguably there are a lot of people who run tech companies who are kind of sadistic, but rather for like a material purpose. The point of making things worse for end users is to make things better for business customers. So for Google, that was obviously advertisers and web publishers. An ever larger fraction of Google's search results were given over to ads, which were marked in ever subtler, ever smaller, ever grayer labels. And Google used that commercial surveillance data to target ads to us on web publishers' web pages and on its own internal platforms. So that's stage two. Things are getting worse for the end users in order to make them better for these business customers. But the business customers, they're also getting locked onto that platform, dependent on those customers. And because as soon as a business gets even 10 or 20% of its revenue from a single source, it becomes very vulnerable to changes in how that source operates. There are very few firms that can survive overnight lasting collapse of 20% of their revenue. And so the companies find themselves more and more reluctant to leave Google, even if the deal from Google gets worse. So we talk a lot about how Google is a monopolist, and yeah, they've lost 3 monopoly trials in the last 18 months. They are a triply convicted monopolist. But that monopoly power is derived from how Google is as a seller, but we sometimes neglect how powerful Google is as a buyer, as a monopsonist. So now you have Google acting as a monopolist for its users, right? That's stage one. But you also have them establishing a monopsony over its sellers, and that's stage two. And once those two stages are completed, you can come to stage three. This is where Google claws back all the value available in the platform leaving behind a kind of homeopathic residue, just enough calculated to keep the users locked in so that business customers will remain locked to those users. And that's when Google becomes enshittified. In 2019, Google hit a turning point, something that we know about thanks to one of those 3 antitrust trials because they published all the memos. Search for Google had grown by 2019 as much as it possibly could. More than 90% of us were using Google to search, and we searched for everything. Any random thought that came into our head, we went and we found a Google search box and we typed it into it. So how was Google going to grow? There were no more users left to switch to Google. Yes, they could raise 1 billion humans to maturity and make them Google users. They called it Google Classroom, but that takes a minute. So what was Google going to do in the meantime? Well, thanks to those internal memos, we know what they did. They made Google search worse. They reduced the system's accuracy so that you had to search more than once to get the answer that you were looking for. And every time you typed a new search query into Google, that was another bite at the apple, another chance to show you some more ads. And so that was how Google attacked us, the users. That was its monopoly power. But it was also acting as a monopsonist. Google entered into an illegal, collusive arrangement with Facebook they called Jedi Blue to rig the ad market so that the ads would cost more for advertisers, but they would pay less to the publishers and leave more for the 2 companies that were responsible at that point for about 80% of the display advertising on the web. And so that's how we get to the Google of today, where you type in a query and what you get back is a lump of AI slop, and under that are 5 paid results tagged with the word ad in 7.90% gray on white type. And under that, 10 spammy links from SEO scumbags who've managed to get past the engineers that Google has bothered to task to fighting spam. But we still use Google because we are locked into Google. And that is enshittification from the outside. A platform is first good to its end users, but locks them in, brings in business customers who are attracted to those end users, locks them in, claws back all the value for itself, and turns into a giant pile of shit. That is enshittification. It's a tragedy in 3 acts. Now, as I said, this journey I've been on to talk about enshittification started with this description of the external characteristics of enshittification, what happens when a firm enshittifies. But I think it's time we started thinking about what's going on inside the companies that makes enshittification possible, the technical mechanism of enshittification, something I call twiddling. Now, digital businesses, they have this infinite flexibility. They get that because they're built on top of Turing-complete universal von Neumann machines, and that means that firms can twiddle the knobs that determine all of the business logic every time you visit them in a highly automated way, so that every time you interact with a service, everything is different. The prices are different, the costs are different, the search rankings are different, the recommendations are different. And this takes me back to the nurses. The scam, where the platform is looking up the nurse's debt load and using that to titrate a bid for the nurse's labor in real time, is just a form of twiddling. It's something that you can only do if you have a computer. I'm just going to move the mic a little so I can put my papers down here. There we go. That's a little better. It's something you can only do with a computer. The bosses who are doing this, they're not even tech bosses. They're just healthcare bosses with some tech tools. So digitalization, right, weaving network computers through a service enables the kind of twiddling that allows companies to shift value around from end users to business customers, from business customers back to end users, but eventually and inevitably all the value going to the shareholders and the executives. And digitization, it's coming to every sector, like nursing, which means that enshittification comes to every sector, including nursing. Now, the legal scholar Veena Dubal, she has a term that she coined to describe this process where you change the wages of workers based on surveillance and behavioral data. She calls it algorithmic wage discrimination. And it follows the gig economy, which is a major locus of enshittification, because the gig economy, it's the kind of tear in reality from which the digital world is leaking into the physical world. Gig work is the kind of job where your shitty boss is a shitty app and you're not even allowed to call yourself an employee. Now, Uber, the kind of godparents of enshittification, they invented this algorithmic wage discrimination trick. If you're an Uber driver and you are selective about which rides you're willing to take, the platform will offer you a higher wage to try and tempt you onto the road, higher per mile, higher per minute. But if you yield to temptation, you start taking those rides, and you take the rides over and over again, which means that you are jettisoning the other things that you used to do for a living that allowed you to be so selective, which means that you're more dependent on Uber. Uber starts to titer the wage down, and they do this in small increments at random intervals that are meant to sit below the threshold of human perception. So they're not really boiling the frog, they're just kind of slow poaching it. Now, what happens is eventually that Uber driver has gone into debt to buy a new car, they've given up their side hustles, and they have to accept the wage that's being offered even as it falls below a living wage. So this twiddling, it's just a crude trick done very quickly. Any task that's simple but time-consuming, we know as hackers, that's a prime candidate for automation. Now, this kind of wage theft would be unbearably tedious, labor-intensive, and expensive to perform manually. No 19th century warehouse full of guys with green eye shades slaving over ledgers could pull this trick off. You need digitization to do this kind of algorithmic wage discrimination, this form of wage theft. Twiddling nurses' hourly wages is a perfect example of the role that digitization plays in enshittification. Because this kind of thing, it's not just a bad deal for nurses, it's a bad deal for patients. I mean, is there anyone who wants their catheter inserted by a nurse who was paid based on how desperate they were and thus what wage they were willing to work for, so that they had to stay up 6 hours after their shift the night before to drive Uber so that they could pay rent and skip breakfast this morning because they couldn't afford the food? Thank you. But this is why it's so wrong to say if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. If you're not paying for the product, ascribes a kind of mystical power to advertising-driven services. It assumes that if you're running an advertising-driven service, that what you're really doing is bypassing our critical faculties by surveilling us and data mining the resulting dossiers to locate our mental blind spots and weaponize them to get us to buy whatever an advertiser is selling. In this formulation, we are complicit in our own exploitation because we chose to use free services and therefore invited that exploitation from surveillance capitalists who perfected the mind control ray powered by surveillance data. And that means that we voluntarily hand over when we use ad-driven services. The moral of this story is that if we would only go back to spending money, paying for things with cash instead of attention, instead of unrealistically expecting everything for free, capitalism would be restored to a functional, non-surveillance state, and companies would start treating us better because we would be the customers and not the products. That's why surveillance capitalism hypothesis elevates companies like Apple to a kind of special status, because Apple is charging us money instead of attention, and that means that it focuses on better service rather than exploiting us. Now, there is a superficially plausible logic to this. After all, in 2022, Apple did update iOS to give you a single tick box that you could tick, and if you ticked that tick box, Apple would block surveillance by the apps on your phone, most notably Facebook's apps. Now, 96% of Apple iPhone owners ticked that box. I assume the other 4% were either drunk or Facebook employees who were drunk, which makes sense, because if I worked at Facebook, I would be drunk all the time. So on the face of it, it does seem like when Apple charges you money instead of attention, they don't treat you as the product. But simultaneously, as Apple was rolling out this privacy measure that was so bad for Facebook, and it cost Facebook $10 billion in the first year, which you love to see, Apple was also secretly turning on exactly the same surveillance that Facebook was doing for iOS users to gather surveillance data for its own ad targeting network. When they were caught doing this, they lied about it. So it goes without saying that that $1,000 Apple distraction rectangle in your pocket is not something that you got for free. You paid for it with money, not attention. But the fact that you paid for it doesn't stop Apple from turning you into the product. Apple treats its business customers, the app vendors, like they're the product. It screws them out of 30 cents of every dollar that they bring in over an app, with mandatory payment processing fees that are 3,000% higher than the industry standard for processing payments. Apple treats the end users, the people who shell out $1,000 for a phone, like they're the product. It spies on them to help target ads to them. Apple treats everyone like the product. So that's what's going on with our gig app nurses. The nurses, they're the product. The patients, also the product. The hospitals, also the product. In enshittification, the product is just anyone you can get away with treating like the product. Fair and dignified treatment is not something you get as a customer loyalty perk for paying for things with money instead of attention. So how do you get fair and dignified treatment? Well, I'm going to get to that, but let's stay with the nurses for a second. The nurses are the product. They are being twiddled because they've been conscripted into the tech industry because their industry has been digitized. So it's tempting to blame digitization for this. But tech companies, they weren't born enshittified. We spent years, we spent decades enjoying pleasing products made by these tech companies. If you're old enough to remember the launch of Google, you'll recall that at the outset, Google was magic. You could ask Jeeves questions for 1,000,000 years, and you could load up Alta Vista with 10 million Boolean operators meant to screen out low-quality results, and you would never come up with the answers that were as crisp, as useful, and as helpful as the ones you got from just typing a few vaguely worded queries into a Google box. There's a reason we all switched to Google. There's a reason so many of us bought iPhones. There's a reason why we joined our friends on Facebook. All of those services were born digital. They could have enshittified at any time, but they didn't until they did. And when they did, they all did it at once. Now, if you were a nurse and every patient that staggered into your emergency room had the same terrible symptoms, you'd call the public health department and report a suspected outbreak of some new dangerous epidemic. Ursula Franklin held that technology's outcomes were not preordained, that they were the result of deliberate choices. And I like that very much. It's a very science fictional way of thinking about technology. Good science fiction is not merely or even primarily about what the gadget does. It's about who the gadget does it for and who the gadget does it to. Those social factors are far more important than the mere technical specifications of the gadget. They're the difference between a system that warns you when you're about to drift out of your lane and a system that tells your insurers that you've been drifting out of your lane so that they can add $10 to your bill this month. It's the difference between a spell checker that lets you know when you made a typo and bossware that lets your manager dock your pay by 2% for having the 11th highest rate of typos in your department. It's the difference between an app that remembers where you parked your car and an app that uses the location of your car for including you in a reverse warrant for the identities of everyone who showed up at an anti-Trump protest. I believe that enshittification is caused by changes to the technology, but it's most importantly caused by changes to the policy environment, changes to the rules of the game that were undertaken in living memory by named parties who were warned at the time of the likely outcome of their policy choices and who ignored those warnings, who today are very rich and very respected, face no consequences and no accountability for their role in ushering in the enshitticene that we're all condemned to live in, who venture out into polite society without ever once wondering whether anyone is sizing them up for a pitchfork. In other words, I think we created the crimogenic environment, a perfect breeding pool for the most pathogenic practices in our societies and our firms. And those pathogenic practices have therefore multiplied, dominating decision-making in firms and in governments, leading to a vast enshittening of everything. Now, there's some good news here, because if enshittification is not the result of a new kind of evil person, or the iron laws of economics, or the great forces of history bearing down on this moment, but rather if enshittification comes from specific policy choices, then we can reverse those choices. We can make better ones. We can emerge from the enshitticene and consign the enshitternet that we use today to the scrap heap of history, an unfortunate transitional stage between the old good internet that we used to have and the new good internet that we deserve. Now, I'm not really going to talk about AI today because, oh my God, is AI a boring, overhyped subject? But I'm going to use a metaphor about AI, about the limited liability company, which is a kind of immortal artificial colony organism in which humans serve as a kind of inconvenient gut flora. My colleague Charlie Strauss calls the corporation the slow AI. So you've got these slow AIs, and their guts are just churning with people. And the AI's imperative, the paperclip that it wants to maximize, is profit. And to maximize profits, you charge as much as you can, you pay your workers and your suppliers as little as you can get away with, and you spend as little as possible on quality and safety. Every dollar you spend on workers, suppliers, or quality is a dollar that you can't spend on executives and shareholders. So there's a simple model of the perfect corporation that maximizes its profits by charging infinity dollars, paying everyone nothing, and producing nothing of value. But that corporation is not going to make any money for the obvious reasons that no one's going to work there, no one's going to sell them anything, and no one's going to buy what they're selling. So firms have constraints that act as disciplining forces on their impulses, on what the kind of perfect state of the infinity dollar, zero products, pays nothing firm would prefer to produce. Those constraints tamp down the artificial life form's impulses to charge infinity and pay nothing. And in tech, there are 4 constraints that discipline firms. The anti-enshittificatory forces of discipline that make products and services better, pay workers more, and keep executives and shareholders' wealth from growing at the expense of suppliers, customers, and labor. Now, the first of these constraints is markets. All other things being equal, businesses that charge more and deliver less lose customers to firms that are more generous in how they share the wealth with their workers and with their customers. Now, this is the bedrock of capitalist theory. It's the ideological basis of antitrust law. Now, the first antitrust law in the world was passed here in the United States in 1890. It was the Sherman Act. And the sponsor was Senator John Sherman, brother of the Civil War General Tecumseh Sherman, and he was quite an orator. And when he was stumping for the Sherman Act on the Senate floor, he gave a speech where he said, if we would not endure a king as a political power, then we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of the necessities of life. If we would not submit to an emperor, we should not submit to an autocrat of trade, with the power to prevent competition and fix the price of any commodity. So Senator Sherman, he wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was reflecting popular rage from the anti-monopolist movement of the day, when proprietors of monopolistic firms assumed the role of dictator, with the power to decide who would work, who would starve, what would be for sale, what wouldn't be for sale, and what the prices would be. Lacking competitors, they were too big to fail, they were too big to jail, and that made them too big to care. As Lily Tomlin used to put it on those old Saturday Night Live sketches where she played a bell operator doing commercials for AT&T, we don't care, we don't have to, we're the phone company. So what happened to the disciplining force of competition? Well, it's not a mystery. We killed it. Starting about 40 years ago, the Reaganomic views of the Chicago School economists transformed how antitrust law was enforced. They threw out John Sherman's idea that we needed to keep companies competitive to prevent the emergence of an autocrat of trade, and installed a new theory of antitrust, that monopolies were efficient. In other words, if you observe that Google has acquired a 90% market share, which it does, then you should infer that Google has built the best search engine ever, the best search engine possible. The only reason a better search engine hasn't stepped in is that Google is so skilled and so efficient that there's no conceivable way that it could be improved on, and you can be sure that that's the case because no new search engine has stepped in to compete with Google. We can tell that Google, in other words, has the best kind of monopoly or you can tell Google, rather, is the best because it has a monopoly, and we can tell that it has the monopoly because it is the best. So 40 years ago, the US and its major trading partners adopted an explicitly pro-monopoly policy, and what we got as a result was monopolies. Monopolies in pharmaceuticals, in beer, in glass bottles, in vitamin C, in athletic shoes, in microchips in cars, in mattresses and eyeglasses, and of course, in professional wrestling. Now, remember, these are specific policies undertaken in living memory by named individuals who got rich and never faced consequences. The economists who conceived of these policies, they're not in the ground. They are still around today, polishing their fake Nobel Prizes, teaching at elite schools, making millions consulting to blue-chip firms seeking to undergo anti-competitive mergers. And when we confront them with the wreckage that their policy created, they protest their innocence. They maintain with a straight face that there is no way to affirmatively connect the pro-monopoly policies they insisted on with the rise of monopolies after those policies were adopted. It's like we used to put down rat poison, and we didn't have a rat problem. And then these guys came along and they said, you don't need the rat poison. And now rats are eating our faces off. And these guys are staring at us with wide, innocent eyes, saying, how can you be so sure that the rat epidemic is because of our anti-rat poison policies? Maybe we have simply entered the time of the rat. Right? Maybe sunspots have caused rats to become more fecund than at any time in human history. And sure, the rats did buy all the rat poison factories and shut them down. But given that we're not putting down rat poison anymore, that is an economically rational, Pareto optimal form of decision making. Markets don't discipline tech firms because tech firms don't compete with their rivals. They buy them. Now, that's not a supposition, it's a quote from Mark Zuckerberg, who very famously put in writing, because this is Mark Zuckerberg, who puts every bad idea he has in writing where a government lawyer can find it, it is better to buy than to compete. Which is why Mark Zuckerberg bought Instagram for $1 billion at a time when it had 12 employees. And as he wrote in a spectacularly ill-advised 2:30 in the morning memo to his CFO, the reason he was buying Instagram is because Facebook users were leaving Facebook for Instagram, and if he bought Instagram, he could recapture them. They could leave Facebook, the platform, but they would still be imprisoned by Facebook, the service. And despite the fact that Zuckerberg put this confession in writing, the Obama administration let them go ahead with the acquisition because every government of every political stripe has adopted the posture that monopolies were efficient. And so even if you have a note in evidence that says, "Dear Bob, just for avoidance of doubt, I want you to understand that the killing we are planning tonight is a murder and we are premeditating it," no one wants to bring a charge. Now think about those twiddled, immiserated nurses. Hospitals are among the most consolidated sectors in America. First, we deregulated pharma mergers. And pharma companies gobbled each other up at the rate of knots and jacked up the price of drugs. So then the hospitals, they also merged to monopoly as a defensive maneuver that allow a single hospital chain to dominate a region or a city and say to the pharma companies, either you make your products cheaper or we are not going to buy them for anyone in town. Of course, once that mission was accomplished, hospitals started screwing insurers, jacking up the price of hospital beds, and so the insurers staged their own incestuous orgy, buying and merging until most Americans have 2 or 3 insurance options, which let the insurers fight back against the hospitals, but left patients and healthcare workers defenseless against the consolidated power of hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, pharmacy benefit managers, group purchasing organizations, and other health industry cartels, duopolies, and monopolies. Which is why nurses are signing up to work for hospitals with these ghastly apps. And remember, there's just 3 of those apps, replacing what used to be dozens and dozens of regional staffing agencies. Meanwhile, on the patient side, competition has never exercised discipline on the health sector. No one has ever shopped around for a cheaper ambulance on the way to a better ER while they're experiencing a heart attack. The price that people are willing to pay to not die is everything. So you have this sector that shouldn't have ever been a commercial enterprise to begin with, losing what little discipline it faced from competition, which paves the way for enshittification. But I said there's 4 forces that discipline discipline industry, not just competition. The second force is regulation, not the discipline imposed by the market, but the discipline imposed by states. It's a mistake to see market discipline and state discipline as fully separate realms. They are intimately connected because competition is a necessary precondition for efficient regulation. Let me put this in terms that even the most ideological libertarians can understand. Say you think that there should only be one regulation that governments enforce, which is enforcing contracts. For the government to serve as a referee in that game, it has to be more powerful than all the players on the field. It has to have the power to compel firms to honor their contracts, which means that the smallest government you can have is determined by the largest corporation you're willing to tolerate. So even if you are the kind of Musk-addled libertarian who can no longer open your copy of Atlas Shrugged because the pages are all still stuck together, who pines for a market in human kidneys and demands the right to sell yourself into bond slavery, you should still want a robust antitrust regime so that contracts can be enforced. When a sector cartelizes, when it collapses into oligarchy, when the internet turns into 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, then it captures its regulators. After all, A sector with 100 competing companies, that's a rabble. They're at each other's throats. They can't agree on anything, especially how they're going to lobby. But when a sector collapses into 5 companies, or 4, or 3, or 2, or 1, it becomes a cartel. It becomes a racket. It becomes a conspiracy in waiting. A sector that has been boiled down to a mere handful of firms can agree on a common, lobbying position. And what's more, they are so insulated from so-called wasteful competition that they are a slosh in cash. And they can mobilize that cash to turn their regulatory preferences into regulation. In other words, they capture their regulators. Now, regulatory capture sounds abstract and complicated, but here's some concrete examples. So in the United Kingdom, there is an excellent antitrust regulator called the Competition and Markets Authority. And it was run by a guy called Marcus Bokerink. Now, the Competition and Markets Authority has been one of the world's most effective investigators and regulators of big tech fuckery. And in January, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, fired Marcus Bokerink and replaced him with a guy called Doug Gurr. Doug Gurr used to run Amazon UK. So back to our nurses. There are plenty of examples of regulatory capture and what's going on with those nurses, but I'm going to pick the most egregious one. The fact that there are data brokers who will sell you the credit history of anyone in America, including a nurse. Now, the reason for this is that the US Congress has not given us a new consumer privacy law since 1988, when Ronald Reagan signed a law called the Video Privacy Protection Act that makes it a crime for video store clerks to tell newspapers which VHS cassettes you have. That's the last technological threat that Congress has defended us against in the realm of privacy. The fact that Congress has not updated Americans' privacy rights since Die Hard was in theaters is not a coincidence, and it's not an oversight. It is expensively procured inaction from a heavily concentrated and wildly profitable privacy invasion industry that has monetized the abuse of human rights at scale. The coalition of keeping privacy rights frozen in the era of the finale of Saint Elsewhere keeps growing because there is an unbounded way to transform the systematic invasion of our human rights into cash. There is a direct line from this phenomenon to the nurses whose paychecks go down when they owe a lot of credit card debt. So competition died. Regulation died. Companies are not disciplined by markets, nor are they disciplined by governments. But there are 4 forces that discipline companies, contributing to the inhospitable environment for the reproduction of sociopathic, enshittifying monsters. So let's talk about the other 2 forces. The first is interoperability, something that I hope is very dear to all of your hearts. The principle that 2 or more things can work together. Anyone's shoelaces go in anyone's shoes, anyone's gas goes in anyone's gas tank, anyone's light bulb can fit in anyone's light socket. In the non-digital world, there's a lot of work involved with interop. You have to agree, for example, with those light bulbs on the pitch and the diameter of the screw, the voltage, the amperage, and the wattage of the socket, or someone gets their hand blown off the next time they change a bulb. But in the digital world, interop is built in because the only computer we know how to make, the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine, is a computer capable of running every valid program, which means that for every 10-foot pile of shit in a product design, there is an 11-foot ladder waiting to be built. For every enshittifying program, there is a disenshittifying program waiting to be written. When HP adds a program to your printer that checks to see whether you're using the OEM cartridge or generic ink, you can write a program that turns off that program so that you can use the ink of your choosing in your printer. Here in the US, there's a company called Para that shipped an app called DoorDash, that shipped an app to help DoorDash drivers figure out how much they were going to get paid. See, DoorDash drivers get twiddled as well. DoorDash was hiding the value of the tip from the driver until they committed to taking the ride, and the tip was the majority of their compensation. So you wouldn't know until you were irrevocably committed to doing a drive, whether that was a $1.50 drive or an $11.50 drive with a $10 tip. So Para, they made an app that extracted the value of the tip from the JSON blob that was transmitted to the phone so that drivers could see it before they agreed to take the job, and DoorDash shut it down. And they were able to shut it down because here in America, apps like Para, they're illegal. Because in 1998, Bill Clinton signed a law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, and Section 1201 of the DMCA makes it a felony to bypass an effective means of access control with a penalty of $500,000 fine and a 5-year prison sentence for a first offense. So just the act of reverse engineering the app like DoorDash is a potential felony, which is why companies are so desperately horny to get you to use their apps instead of their websites. An app is just a website skinned with the right kind of IP to make it a crime to use it in ways that advantages your interests over the interests of the company that made it. So the web is open, apps are closed, and the majority of web users have installed an ad blocker, which of course is also a privacy blocker. But no one installs ad blockers for apps, because ad blockers for apps are a felony to distribute. It's because you have to reverse engineer an app in order to make that ad blocker. So an app is just a website wrapped in IP that makes it illegal to protect your privacy while you use it. All over the world, we have enacted this thicket of laws that we broadly call IP laws that make it illegal to modify services, products, and devices so that they serve your interests instead of the interests of the company that made them. For example, when HP puts the digital lock on the printer that checks for OEM ink instead of third-party ink, it becomes a crime to bypass that lock. And that means that it becomes a crime to use third-party ink. And once HP and the small handful of firms that dominate inkjet printing have made it a crime for you to change out your ink cartridge for a generic, they're able to raise and raise and raise the price of ink. And so today, ink is the most expensive fluid you can buy as a civilian without getting a special permit. It runs more than $10,000 a gallon. You print your grocery lists with colored water that costs more than the semen of a Kentucky Derby winning stallion. Now, that is the world that we got from the DMCA. And we got it in living memory. The world where farmers can't fix their tractors, where independent mechanics can't diagnose your car, where hospitals during the pandemic lockdowns couldn't fix their ventilators, where every time an iPhone user buys an app, every dollar they spend takes a round trip through Apple headquarters and comes back 30 cents lighter. And this is a world in which nurses cannot get counter apps or plugins for their Uber for Nursing app that allows them to compare their wages with other nurses, to refuse wages below a certain threshold, to even compile systematic evidence of discrimination in the wages that they're being paid. So interoperability was once a major disciplining force on tech firms. After all, if you make the ads on the website sufficiently obnoxious, some fraction of your users are going to install an ad blocker. And when they install that ad blocker, the revenue from those ads doesn't go up, as you might hope, by making the ads more invasive, and it doesn't stay where it was before you made the ads more invasive. The revenue from a user who's installed an ad blocker is zero. And it stays at zero forever because no one has ever voluntarily uninstalled their ad blocker. But once it's illegal to make an ad blocker for an app, there's just no reason to make that app as invasive as you possibly can because users can't change it. So you can shift all the value from end users to shareholders and to executives. And that means that we get monopolies. And monopolies capture their regulators. And they ignore the laws they don't like. And they prevent laws that might interfere with their activities, like privacy laws, from being passed. They can mobilize existing laws against their rivals to stop their products from being disenshittified. And 3 of the 4 forces that discipline companies are neutralized: competition, regulation, and interoperability. But there's one remaining disciplining force on tech firms, and it's you. It's the tech labor force. Now, tech workers are a strange form of workforce because historically we have been very powerful. We were able to command high wages and respect, but we did it without joining unions. Union density in tech is very low. It basically rounds to 0. Our power as tech workers didn't come from our solidarity, it came from our scarcity. There just weren't enough tech workers to fill all the jobs that were going begging. And tech workers are unfathomably productive. The tech sector at its best is making about $1 million per worker. Even with the sky-high salaries that workers command, there's still a lot of money left over to make. Now, faced with a tight labor market and that incredible productivity of tech workers, tech bosses pulled out all the stops to motivate their workforce. They appealed to our sense of mission. They convinced us that we were holy warriors ushering in the new digital age. Google promised us that we would organize the world's information and make it useful. Facebook promised us that we would make the world more open and connected. Now, there's a name for this tactic. The librarian theorist Fobazi Ettar, she calls it vocational awe. This is an appeal to a sense of mission and pride to motivate workers to work for longer hours and under worse conditions with worse pay. And there are all kinds of professions that are oriented around vocational awe: teaching, daycares, elder care, and nursing. But techies our vocational law is a little different because historically we've been incredibly scarce, which meant that while our bosses could motivate us to work in projects that we believed in for endless hours, the minute bosses ordered us to enshittify those projects that we'd missed our mother's funerals to ship on time, we could tell our bosses to fuck off. And if the bosses pressed those demands, we could walk off the job, go across the street, and have another job by lunchtime. So for many years, tech workers were the fourth and final bulwark against enshittification, holding the line after the constraints of competition, regulation, and interop slipped away. But then we got the mass tech layoffs, 260,000 in 2023, 150,000 in 2024, tens of thousands this year. Facebook did a 5% headcount reduction the same day they announced that they were doubling their executives' bonuses. Tech workers, we don't tell our bosses to go fuck themselves anymore because there's 10 other workers waiting to take our jobs. The tech workforce no longer disciplines bosses. It disciplines tech workers. Now, I promised I wasn't going to talk about AI, but I'm going to break the promise a little here just to point out that the reason we hear so much about code bots is because tech bosses are so incredibly desperate for a tech worker that will never tell them to fuck off. And that's what they're dreaming of when they talk about LLMs writing code. So this is where enshittification comes from. Multiple changes to the environment, the fourfold collapse of competition, regulation, interoperability, and worker power. This creates the enshittigenic environment where the greediest and most sociopathic elements in the body corporate thrive at the expense of those elements that once held their worst impulses in check, that acted as moderators on enshittification. Now, we can try to cure these corporations. We can use antitrust law to break them up. We can fine them. We can force strictures upon them. But until we fix the environment, the contagion will continue to spread to other firms. So let's talk about how we create the hostile environment for enshittifiers. So the population and importance of those enshittifying agents within companies dwindles to, say, the levels we enjoyed in the 1990s. We're not going to get rid of them. So long as the profit motive is intact, there will be people for whom the pursuit of profit is pathological, unmoderated by either shame or decency. But we can change the environment so these aren't the people in control. So these aren't the people who make the rules. So let's talk about antitrust. After a 40-year coma for antitrust enforcement, this decade has seen a massive, unprecedented global resurgence of antitrust vigor that comes in both right-wing and left-wing flavors. Over the past 4 years, the Biden administration's enforcers in the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, and the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau did more antitrust enforcement than all of their predecessors combined over the last 40 years. Now, there are major factions within the Trump administration who are very hostile to this agenda, but Trump's antitrust enforcers at the FTC and DOJ have kept intact the new merger guidelines that were promulgated under Biden that ban companies from engaging in anti-competitive mergers. And they've already filed suit to stop a giant tech merger. And of course, last summer, a judge found Google guilty of having a monopoly. And when it came into the remedy phase, deciding how we're going to break Google up as a result, Trump's DOJ enforcers carried the same position that Biden's DOJ enforcers had. And then there's Canada. In Canada, where I'm from, I'm like all the best Americans, I'm a Canadian. In Canada, where I come from, we have this bullshit Competition Bureau. In the Competition Bureau's entire history, it's challenged 3 mergers, but it's mounted 0 successful merger challenges. But last fall, Parliament passed this big, muscular new package of powers for the Competition Bureau, now making it one of the most powerful competition agencies in the world. Now, it's true that in the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer fired the head of the Competition and Markets Authority and replaced him with the former head of Amazon UK. But the thing is, that amazing work that the Competition and Markets Authority did over the last decade, it did through the most reactionary, dysfunctional, conservative governments that the UK has seen in a century. So in the EU, we've seen the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. It's going after big tech with both barrels. And other countries around the world, Australia, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, and even China, have passed new antitrust laws. They've launched major antitrust investigations, and they're collaborating with each other. So when the UK Competition and Markets Authority did a deep market study on how Apple and Google were ripping people off with the App Store tax, that became the basis for the Digital Markets Act and was then used for successful investigations in South Korea and Japan because the tech companies run the same scams everywhere. So once you have the evidence on the table in one country, you can use it to bring successful prosecutions in other countries. Well, what about regulatory capture? We are starting to see regulators getting a little bit smarter about enforcing against big tech. So that Digital Markets Act in the European Union, it shifts enforcement. It used to be that with laws like the GDPR, the privacy law, you've all seen these GDPR dialogues that you have to click through to say I consent. Those are illegal. Right? They're supposed to just let you go on with your business, and unless you find the spot where it says, please spy on me, they're not allowed to spy on you. Right? But the reason that that law has not been enforced is because all of the companies that, American tech companies in Europe pretend that they're based in Ireland, because Ireland lets them cheat on their taxes. But the thing about being a tax haven is you have to be a crime haven, because any company that can pretend it's Irish today can pretend it's Luxembourgeois or Cypriot or Maltese or Dutch tomorrow. And so to keep them from upping sticks and going to another country, you have to give them a favorable regulatory environment in every dimension. You have to agree not to enforce privacy law, which is why the Irish data commissioner, to a first approximation, never gets out of bed. And when they do, they sit around in their underwear all day eating breakfast cereal and watching cartoons, which is why all the big cases against Meta and Google went to Ireland and died. And after 9 years, they're finally making their way to the federal courts. The Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act are going to start all privacy cases in the federal courts in Europe. So last year, Canada passed two very exciting, very big bills. Bill C-44 is a national right to repair law, and Bill C-294 is a national interop bill. Now, these are really good news. Nominally, these allow Canadians to fix everything from tractors to insulin pumps and modify the software in their devices from game consoles to printers so that they work with third-party apps, consumables, and add-ons. However, both of those laws are effectively useless because in 2012, the US Trade Representative threatened to impose tariffs on Canada unless Canada agreed to pass a law like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And in 2012, Canada passed a bill called C-11 that is just a copy-paste of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It's actually slightly worse than the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that bans reverse engineering. And so you can repair or make interoperable anything you want in Canada, provided there's no DRM. But every printer, every smart speaker, every car, every tractor, every appliance, every medical implant, every hospital device has DRM. So if there's a digital lock that stops you from fixing it, or modifying it, or using third-party parts, apps, or app stores, you can't use these two laws, which means that the two laws amount to ornaments. So why wouldn't Canada get rid of this 2012 law? Well, because the laws are part of Canada's trade agreements with the United States. It's the law that Canada needs to keep on the books, otherwise America is going to put tariffs on Canada. Well, happy fucking Liberation Day, everyone. So far, Canada has not had a great response to the Trump tariffs. They're imposing retaliatory tariffs, which makes all the American products Canadians buy 25% more expensive. This is a very weird way to punish America. It's like punching yourself in the face really hard and hoping the downstairs neighbor says, ouch. But you know what would be better? Abolish the Canadian laws that protect US big tech companies from Canadian competitors. Make it legal to reverse engineer, jailbreak, and modify American technology products and services. Make it legal for Canadian mechanics to jailbreak a Tesla. And unlock every subscription feature and all the software upgrades permanently for one price that stays in the country with not one nickel going to Elon Musk. Sure, we can get angry at Elon Musk's Nazi salute, but that guy loves the attention. If you really want to strike back at Elon Musk, you got to kick him in the dongle. So let Canadians stand up Canadian app stores for Apple devices and consoles, the one that charges 3% to process a payment, not 30%. So every Canadian news outlet that gets a new subscriber through an app, and every Canadian software author, musician, and writer who sells through a mobile platform gets a 25% increase in their pay overnight without signing up a single new customer. But of course, they will sign up new customers because they can sell jailbreaking tools around the world to all the other countries that have deliberately kept their tech sector in chains to avoid tariffs from the United States. They can sell jailbreaking tools for mobile devices, games consoles. They can sell them for tractors and cars. They could sell every mechanic a $25 a month kit that will repair any car that comes off the line the month it comes off the line. Every farmer in the world could buy a kit that lets them fix their own John Deere tractors without paying a $200 call-out charge for a John Deere technician to come and type an unlock code into a repair that they did themselves. People around the world would beat a path to Canada's door. Canada could become a major tech export powerhouse while making everything cheaper for Canadians, while making everything more profitable for anyone who sells media or software or services through digital platforms. And this is the best part. It is a direct strike on the most profitable companies in America, the companies whose CEOs paid $1 million each out of their own pockets to sit behind Donald Trump on the dais. It is not an indiscriminate attack on all Americans, right? Tariffing soybeans just hurts some farmer in a state that begins and ends with a vowel who never did anything to Canada, right? Whereas dropping protection for American big tech strikes at the American ruling class, who are the shareholders in American big tech. Canada does not have to confine itself to exporting reasonably priced pharmaceuticals to Americans. They could also export these tools to us here in the United States because we were the first victims of these predatory scams. That's how you win a trade war. So what about workers? Well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that public approval for unions in America is at a high watermark last seen in the 1960s. And more workers want to join a union now than at any time in generations. Unions themselves have the largest amount of money in their cash reserves that they've had in history, and they could use that money to organize workers. But here's the bad news. The unions spent the Biden years when they had the most favorable regulatory environment since the Carter administration, when public support for unions was at an all-time high, when more workers than ever wanted to join unions, when they had more money than they'd ever had to spend on organizing efforts, doing fuck all. They allocated mere pittances to union organizing drives, and with the result that at the end of the Biden years, there were fewer unionized American workers than there had been at the start of the Biden years. And now we have Trump, who illegally fired National Labor Relations Board member Gwynne Wilcox, left the organization without a quorum, so they can't certify new unions. They can't do new investigations. So this is terrible. But it's not game over. Trump fired the referees, but that doesn't mean that the game is over. It means that there's no more rules. Trump thinks that labor laws created unions, but he's wrong. Unions are how we got labor law. Long before unions were legal, we had unions. They fought with the goons and the ginks and the company finks in pitched battles in the streets, and their illegal solidarity resulted in the passage of labor law, which legalized unions. Labor law was passed because workers built power through solidarity. Law doesn't create solidarity, it merely gives it the formal basis. Strip away the formal basis, and worker power remains. Worker power is the answer to vocational law because it's good. If you and your fellow workers feel a sense of mission in your jobs, if you feel a duty to protect your users, if you're Tron-pilled and you fight for the users, your patients, your patrons, your students, a union lets you fulfill that duty. So the unscheduled mid-air disassembly of American labor law means that workers, we can have each other's backs again. And tech workers need other workers' help. Because tech workers, we're not scarce anymore, not after 500,000 layoffs, which means tech bosses, they're not afraid of us anymore. And we know how tech bosses treat workers that they're not afraid of. Look at Jeff Bezos. Workers in Amazon warehouses are critically injured at 3 times the rate of workers in other warehouses. Amazon delivery drivers have to pee in bottles, and they're monitored by AI cameras that snitch on them if their eyeballs aren't in the correct orientation or if their mouths are open while they drive because they're not allowed to sing on the job. By contrast, Amazon coders show up for work with pink mohawks, facial piercings, and black t-shirts that say things their bosses don't understand. And anytime they want to pee, they just go and pee. Jeff Bezos is not sentimental about tech workers, nor does he harbor a particularized hatred of warehouse workers and delivery drivers. He treats the workers as terribly as he can get away with. And that means that the pee bottles are coming for tech workers too. And it's not just Amazon. Think about Apple. Tim Cook was elevated to CEO in 2011. The reason the Apple board chose him to succeed Steve Jobs is because he's the guy who figured out how to farm out Apple manufacture to Chinese contract manufacturers without skipping on quality assurance or suffering leaks of product specifications before their big glitzy launches. Today, Apple products are made in a gigantic Foxconn factory in Zhengzhou. It's nicknamed iPhone City, and indeed, those phones arrive in shipping containers at the Port of Los Angeles in a state of pristine perfection, manufactured to the finest tolerances without any leaks before the products are announced. And to achieve this miraculous supply chain, all Tim Cook had to do was turn iPhone City into a living hell, such that Foxconn had to put suicide nets around the worker dorms to catch the plummeting bodies of workers who were so brutalized by Tim Cook's sweatshop that they would rather die than go to work. Tim Cook is not sentimentally attached to tech workers, nor is he hostile to Chinese assembly line workers. He just treats the workers as badly as he can get away with. And with mass layoffs in the tech sector, he can treat coders a lot worse. So how do tech workers get unions? Well, there are tech-specific organizations. There's Tech Solidarity and the Tech Workers Coalition. I commend them to your attention. But tech workers, we're only going to get our unions by having solidarity with other kinds of workers and receiving solidarity back from them. We need to support every union. All workers need to have all other workers' backs. We are entering an era of omni-shambolic polycrisis. The ominous rumble of climate change, authoritarianism, genocide, xenophobia, and transphobia has turned into an avalanche. The perpetrators of these crimes against humanity have weaponized the internet, colonizing the 21st century's digital nervous system and using it to attack the host, threatening civilization itself. And the Enshittification was purpose-built for this kind of apocalyptic co-option, organized around giant corporations who would trade a habitable planet and human rights for a 2% tax cut, who default us all into twiddle-friendly algorithmic feeds and block the interoperability that allow us to escape their clutches, with the backing of powerful governments whom they can call upon whenever their IP rights are violated. It didn't have to be this way. The Enshittification was not inevitable. It was the product of specific policy choices made in living memory by named individuals. They chose Enshittification. We do not have to be the eternal prisoners of the catastrophic policy blunders of clueless lawmakers 25 years ago. As the omni-crisis polyshambles unfolds around us, countries around the world have the means, motive, and opportunity to craft policies that bolster their sovereignty, protect their rights, and help them set every technology user in every country, including this one, free. The Trump presidency is an existential crisis, but it presents opportunities too. When life gives you SARS, you make sarsaparilla. We once had an old, good internet whose major defect was that it required too much technical expertise to use, so our normie friends were excluded from that amazing party we were all enjoying. Web 2.0's services had greased slides that made it really easy to join up, but they had greased poles you had to climb to get out. A new good internet is possible and necessary. We can build it. It can have all the technological self-determination of the old good internet and all the ease of use of Web 2.0. It can be a place where we can find each other, coordinate, and mobilize to resist and survive the climate collapse, fascism, genocide, and authoritarianism. We can build that new good internet, and we must. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.